Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for daring the elements and come here in this awful weather. It's very rainy and very cold, but it's wonderful to see you all here. And we are going to play two pieces, and there will be a short interval between the two of them because the two pieces will need a total of 4 instruments. This one, that big beast in the back, and 2 different cellos. So in order to change over, we will ask you to give us 10 minutes maybe in between the two pieces. And now I hand over to Nicholas, and he will start introducing the Beethoven.
Thank you very much, Zoltán, and I'd like to reiterate Zoltán's thanks to you all for coming along tonight. It's wonderful to see you all here. Before we speak at all about specific pieces, I'd just like to talk a little bit about what we are doing in this thing that's kind of a concert tonight. So these days it is not at all uncommon for professional musicians to be well versed in playing both historical and modern instruments, and relatedly in both historical and modern performing styles. Organisations like the Australian Chamber Orchestra require that kind of versatility from their musicians. But what is far rarer, and in fact, to the best of our knowledge, unprecedented, is doing that in one concert. So what we are going to be doing tonight is playing 2 sonatas for piano and cello, more on that label in a moment, both German, both broadly 19th century, the Beethoven 1796, but who's counting, both in the key of F major, for those of you with absolute pitch, and both by very young composers at the start of their artistic journeys. The Opus 5 number 1 by Ludwig van Beethoven and the Opus 6 by Richard Strauss. Now, the Beethoven we're going to be playing on classical cello and on this beast, which I'll speak about in a moment, a replica of a Graf early piano. The Strauss will be playing on more modern instruments, so this Shigeru Kawai at the back here, although I don't think that's probably so modern, is it, Zoltán?
No.
How old?
This cello was made shortly after Beethoven's time, so it's early 19th century.
But it doesn't show its age. So, a little bit then about the instruments that we're playing tonight. Zoltán, would you like to speak briefly about playing on this classical cello and how that experience feels compared to perhaps playing on modern cello?
It's a very different experience. The cello looks similar. However, you will notice how in many, many ways it is actually different. Most obviously, it doesn't have the end pin that was not used in Beethoven's times at all. It was sort of invented in the middle of the 19th century. It didn't become common until late Brahms, late 19th century times. There are pictures left to us where ladies played the cello and they put the end of the cello in several books in front of them, which kept slipping away. So it wasn't a very happy solution altogether. The bow is different. It's a much smaller, thinner bow than what we use in modern times. The strings are made out of gut, and there are other structural differences. And by using an instrument like this, that instrument matches the Graf piano, and Beethoven actually had a Graf piano in his house. But Nicholas can fill you in on that.
Absolutely. So this sonata was 1796. The instrument I have here behind me is a replica by the American historical keyboard maker Paul McNulty of an 1819 Conrad Graf forte piano. Now, the terminology around pianos is a little confusing sometimes. We hear of piano fortes, we hear of forte pianos. It's sort of, okay, can we have a mezzo forte or something? But basically, a forte piano is a wooden frame piano. The older variants would have had knee levers instead of the foot pedals that we have on modern pianos. This one actually has foot pedals. So, at the time this piece was written, Beethoven would have been playing on a slightly earlier piano, forte piano, something like a 1790s Walter, but he really liked the Graf, and he actually got Graf to provide him a piano later on in 1825. So, just a couple of observations then from my side on playing this compared to playing the Black Beast in the back there. The touch is a lot shallower, the key travels a lot less far down to what we say is the key bed. The keys are also narrower, which means it's very easy to slip off. And if, like me, you're used to playing modern piano, you feel like a puppy with big feet. But I will do my very best to, make sure the puppies had house training before this evening's performance. The sound is a lot more transparent. It's a lot clearer. It's less powerful, perhaps, although it certainly sparkles. It certainly has a resonance. What I think is really interesting, though, is how the process of switching between these instruments actually affects our music making more broadly and affects our approach to playing on modern instruments. For me, when I come back to the modern piano after playing on the Graf, it feels so heavy, in a good way and a bad way. A good way in the sense of, oh, thank God I'm not going to miss anything now. For the avoidance of doubt, I probably will still miss things, but you know what I mean. It feels more secure, but also it doesn't have that kind of sparkle that the Graf has. And doesn't have the crystalline sound. You can certainly get brilliance on the modern piano, kind of metallic brilliance, but the sparkle, perhaps not quite the same. Okay, so for the Beethoven, we're going to be playing, as I mentioned, in a historical performing style informed by what has been excavated from reverse engineering from historical recordings and treatises about how people played in the 19th century, using devices that maybe your average student of the piano or your average student of the cello today might not be encouraged to use. So things like a little more flexibility of tempo, modification of rhythm in some subtle cases. For the cello, portamento, sliding between notes, some non-vibrato effects. For the forte piano, arpeggiating chords, rolling them like a harp rather than playing them blocked together in some ways. The Strauss, however, we will play in what you might call a sort of post-1950s style, although there is, of course, stylistic cross-pollination, and that's another question. Okay, I don't want to talk too much longer because you've been very, very forbearing with this little chat, and I'm sure you all want to hear some music. So, just a few things on the Beethoven. This is the first of Beethoven's 5 sonatas for piano and cello, and before the cellists in the room come at me about that, that is the standard way that duo sonatas for piano and string instrument were built in the 19th century and shortly before. And in fact, this pair of sonatas, Opus 5, from which we're playing the first, was billed on the original edition as grand sonatas for pianoforte with obbligato violoncello. Now, to be clear, even for a pianist with my ego, I don't actually think that Zoltán's part is obbligato. Of course, there's an absolutely equal partnership between the instruments in this sonata. But what we don't have is a cello piece with piano accompaniment. We don't have that in any way, shape or form. It's only in 2 movements, which is a little unusual. Normally we expect sonatas to be in 3 or 4 movements. We have a very, very big first movement with a slow introduction and then a really long, quite athletic, quite concerto-like main first movement, and then a little rondo, a light little rondo with which to finish, with an interesting episode in the middle of the rondo, which might be in dialogue with what was perceived as a Turkish style or some other exotic, i.e. non-Germanic style at the time. We've got these crushed ornaments and things like that. Is there anything else you want to say about the Beethoven?
Maybe 2 small things. One, very interestingly, this is possibly the first sonata, major sonata, that is genuinely written for equal parts between the piano and the cello. There used to be cello sonatas beforehand, but they were just cello sonata with a little harmony from the piano.
Continuum.
They were not equal partners. From now on, from Beethoven's very early sonata, they became quite equal in significance. And that is very important, because that explains the Schubert and the Brahms and the Schumann sonatas all around the 19th century. The other mention that I would like to make is that Nicholas mentioned that we have all these treatises helping us to understand how to play these pieces. That is all very well, except they very often contradict each other. So you read one famous treatise by Philipp Emanuel Bach, the second oldest son of Johann Sebastian, and then you read Father Mozart's Leopold's treatise about the same idea, and he would say something very different. So it takes a lot of research, a lot of reading, a lot of trying out. So a big part of our work together was Nicholas came up with an idea and we said, yeah, that's a good one. I came up with an idea. We said, no, that's not such a good one. Or the other way.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, it was normally the other way around. Please continue.
So the working process is still happening, and you are the first people we have a chance to play this piece. And we are very glad that you are here. Thank you very much.
Just to clarify, we'll be playing the Beethoven. We'll then have a 15-minute interval in which you're welcome to leave the hall briefly, so long as you return on time. Then we'll speak for a far shorter amount of time, don't you worry, about the Strauss and play the Strauss. So please enjoy Beethoven 5 number 1. Thank you.
smile. Okay, so we are shifting forward almost exactly 100 years. And we will be in the capable hands of the very young Richard Strauss. Now, most of you who think about Richard Strauss, you are thinking about the voluptuous big operas, Salome, Rosenkavalier, Elektra, or those fantastic tone poems, Also sprach Zarathustra, and so on. He didn't start like that. He came from a very well-to-do family, and he was very interested in playing music, and he learned the piano to the detriment of Nicholas's hard work here, because he wrote a very difficult piano part for this sonata. And his early works, up until he was about 18 or so, mostly chamber music. He wrote 2 piano trios, he wrote a violin sonata, a cello sonata, a piano sonata, various other things. Mostly lovely pieces, but completely different from what happened later. So, about 4 years after he wrote this cello sonata, he wrote his first symphonic poem. It's usually referred to in German, Aus Italien, from Italy. And very soon comes Don Juan, which is like so powerful and such a revolutionary language. What is amazing about this sonata is that he learned so much from his predecessors. There's a lot of Beethoven in this, there's a lot of Schumann, a lot of Mendelssohn, all in his own language. He's not copying them, his ideas are infiltrated with these geniuses before him. He's very much a German master. Nicholas, anything to add?
I am actually going to problematize something you just said, that his...
He does it all the time in rehearsals too.
I know, it's giving you a taste. That his work is sort of infiltrated by the spirit, but maybe not the letter of earlier composers. It's also infiltrated by the letter of earlier composers. There are lots of what, at least to modern eyes, seem to be intertextual allusions to other pieces. Sometimes chronology notwithstanding, and that's a postmodern discussion for another day. But things like the slow movement of the last Beethoven, Sonata for Piano and Cello, the Liszt Piano Sonata, potentially Beethoven Ghost Trio as well in the second movement. Just to build on what Zoltán said about the character of the piece, it's ardent, it's passionate, it's lush romantic, but it's not an overly tortured work, I think it's fair to say. It's relatively sunny for the most part. The second movement's pretty dark, but even the second movement has, well, it almost has a happy ending and then it ends in tragedy. But leaving that aside, it's generally a pretty sunny piece. It's also interesting for how economical Strauss is with his melodic and motivic material. And it stands in stark contrast to the first movement of the Beethoven, which was really expansive, as you heard, lots of detours onto little side alleyways and things, and unexpected modulations and multiple themes in sections of the movement and things like that. This is a lot terser, a lot more concise in many ways, and it's also very textbook in a structural or a formal way. I'm not going to get into the weeds of that now, but really it's very sort of paradigmatic and conventional in the way it uses musical structure. I don't think there's anything else I want to say about Strauss. Is there anything else you want to say about Strauss? No?
Anyone under 12 can go to Nicholas afterwards and he will explain what paradigmatic means. The rest is very, very clear, isn't it?
And actually, speaking of coming to us afterwards, this has been an experimental, exploratory project for Zoltán and I, and we welcome any feedback you can share. So if anybody wants to come and have a chat to us afterwards, feel absolutely free to do so. Thank you so much for coming along tonight. We won't be speaking to you again. We'll just play some Strauss. Enjoy.
Thank you.